Thank you for joining us for tonight's March Q&A talk, March 2024 Q&A talk. It is now the season 2024 for Q&A talks. I am tonight's host, Q&A Talks program coordinator, Cody McRae-Cullum. My personal pronouns are he, him, but if you are feeling bold, please feel free to refer to me with my preferred pronoun, the royal we. Q&A Talks connects rural parents and caregivers of LGBTQIA+ youth with the resources they need to ensure their children can grow up safely and authentically. Q&A Talks is an initiative of Project Q&A and is made possible by grants from the Independence Area Community Trust and the American Libraries Association Libraries Transform Communities, focus on rural and small library grant in partnership with the Independence Public Library. Tonight, we are thrilled to have as our speaker, Cornelius Baker, pronouns he, him, the Safe Zone Programming Coordinator for the Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity at the University of Kansas. He holds a Master of Social Work degree through Columbia University in Advanced Generalist Practice and Programming. His interests involve queer media and the criminalization of queer and trans individuals in the legal system. He is currently obsessed with finding queer-specific reality dating dating shows to watch. It can be referred as on TV.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. All right. So, welcome, Cornelius. Thank you for joining us, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Cody. I
Absolutely.
do a quick introduction, especially in the sense of the topic for today. As was said, my name is Cornelius Baker, he, him, his pronouns, and I am a program coordinator at the center. So a lot of what I do typically will focus on giving presentations, trainings, especially around all things related to the queer and trans community, both on campus as well as off campus. Today I was asked to come to talk about pronoun usage, especially as it relates to a family environment. So a lot of the types of presentations that we typically will do we'll focus on a couple of different areas. Pronoun usage is one that comes up very often, especially in one of our main trainings, Safe Zone. So we created a presentation specifically for that topic, just because we realize in conversations that there's a lot more in depth we can go with a lot of things that come up, especially around pronouns, especially in our current climate. So we will be going through a lot of those pieces today for the presentation. Coming from university as well, we love learning outcomes. So do like to include those, especially to give people an idea, as well as an agenda for the presentation. So we'll be focusing on identifying the importance of gender pronouns in relation to the queer and trans community, recognizing the systemic implications of unfair or unjust uncivil behavior towards non-conformative gender identities, as well as talking about participants in participation in appropriate corrective measures when dealing with things like dead naming or misgendering, which we will get into, especially within this conversation a bit. But just to give you an idea of some of the topics we should be touching on. Usually like to start with just going over the first general question, what are pronouns? I think this is an important place to start, especially because when we're thinking about the next question here, in what context have you previously heard pronouns discussed? Oftentimes what we hear as responses for these questions in particular is it often coming from a negative space. As I mentioned before, in our current climate in particular, there has been a lot more, I would say, visible or heightened visibility around things like pronouns and discussions around pronouns, but also because of that, there's a lot of misinformation that has come out as well. When we are talking about topics like pronouns, we always like to preface that when we're thinking about terms like this, they are often terms that can be very loaded, especially in the space that we are in now. And it can come with a lot of different connotations for people depending on the context in which they were introduced to it as. So in basic general terms, when we're talking about pronouns, we are speaking about more likely than not, how people like to be referred to as. So when we're thinking about some of those pronouns, some we may be familiar with, others we may not necessarily be as familiar with, but people more likely oftentimes, again, will have an introduction to pronouns in relation or in some type of relation, possibly to the queer and trans community, although pronouns are a part of languages that we use, in English in particular, things that we use, things that we discuss, in everyday conversations, regardless of if we're always noticing how they come up or how they may not come up in a lot of our conversations. So like to provide just as a basis, simplistic way of understanding this topic from the start, we're talking about how people would like you to refer to them as. In these conversations, I think it's also important to kind of break down some pieces, some constructions, especially around social constructions like gender. When we're talking about some of these topics, oftentimes our conversations, like with pronouns, can get tied into a lot of other conversations that we have as well. So where some of that misinformation can come in is oftentimes not necessarily talking about a lot of these topics in ways that we are communicating in the same way or talking about the same thing, even though we may be using the same terminology or the same words. So when we talk about gender, we like to break them down into 3 specific sections to make sure that we're covering a wider breadth of what we are trying to convey. So gender, oftentimes when we're thinking about it, we will think of gender as gender identity. So more individually, more internal, how you identify yourself. That is oftentimes what people will think of when we are talking about gender, how you view yourself as regards to your gender. With that, there oftentimes can be other pieces that pull in how others interpret that gender, interpret that expression. So expression is another key factor. So not just looking internally at how you identify, but externally, how you may present yourself to other people. What does that gender expression look like? So this could be related to things like accessories, maybe the ways that you dress. Oftentimes when we're talking about expression, we may bring in terms like masculinity, femininity, androgynous, different ways that people may choose to express their gender in a way that is external from themselves being presented to others. And then lastly, one piece that we don't often touch on is perception. So a piece that is important because when we're talking about gender, as a social construct, we may not all have the same concepts as far as what it means or how we identify or what that expression externally, how we identify is showing up or how that is showing up for other people, how they may be interpreting the gender identity based off of the way that we are expressing or the way that we are maybe explaining our gender internally. So these important pieces want to keep in mind, especially for our conversation, because when we're thinking about a lot of assumptions or mistakes, especially that can come into place, especially assumptions around assuming pronouns based off of maybe the way that someone is expressing their gender, the way that you are seeing that gender being expressed based off of your interpretation or perception can oftentimes be where things like misgendering someone can come into play, especially when we're talking about pronouns. So we were wanting to talk about the ways that we present ourselves to the world when we're thinking about pronouns. As we mentioned first at the start of the presentation, this is not an issue in particular that is specific to the queer and trans community. We use pronouns in a variety of different ways in a lot of different contexts. This has come up especially as an important topic for the queer and trans community, especially individuals that may be trans, gender nonconforming, because of the context of the situation and conversations that we have today. Oftentimes when we are talking about pronouns or introducing pronouns to people that may be unfamiliar with it in the trainings that we currently do, we will discuss kind of the normalization of making sure that we're introducing ourselves with our names, with our pronouns when meeting new people. So it shows up in a Zoom link here. I have it in my email signature, on name tags. It's something that has been incorporated more so into the norm of introductions, especially in the spaces that I have been in over most recent years. When we're thinking about how that comes up or why that comes up, there are a couple of different factors that come into play, because there are a lot of different benefits with introducing yourself with pronouns. So wanting to touch on some of those. One in particular demonstrates that you know what pronouns are. So it can often be a signal for others, especially maybe someone who is introducing themselves with pronouns that people may be unfamiliar with using. It allows kind of a safety net, you could say, to let people know that if they are wanting to have conversations around pronouns, or if they may be apprehensive around introducing themselves with pronouns in a particular space, you are showing that you could be receptive, that you are going to be validating, especially if what is shared. So giving a hint to trans people that you will maintain a space that respects their pronouns. Previous supervisor, I had kind of talked about it as a thermometer. So looking at feeling that thermometer based off of different ways that people show up in spaces. Oftentimes, speaking for myself as a queer person showing up in spaces, there are certain signs or certain things that you may look for or signals to show maybe how supportive or accepting a space may be. This is very similar when we're talking about pronouns as well. So being able to have that represented in some way, like introducing yourselves with pronouns, is able to give that signal to others that you are someone that they can trust, especially with this space, especially if they are having situations where it may be a hostile experience when they share their pronouns in a particular space, or an issue of safety even. When we're talking about these benefits as well, other pieces is introducing the concept of pronouns to people who may be unfamiliar with the concept. So one thing that I think is important, especially working in spaces where people may not necessarily be as familiar with why we are introducing ourselves with pronouns or have them visible in certain spaces, can be important to also use this as a time for education. So in my email signature, as an example, I will have a link to a website that we will talk about a little bit later on as well, and I will briefly show mypronouns.org if people have questions about why I'm including my pronouns in my email signature. So there's a direct link right there that it literally says what are pronouns, and I will link to that website to give people that opportunity to educate themselves or get further information or resources around the topic too. And then lastly, it helps people to understand the current climate. As mentioned before, I think it can be really important context that can be provided for people in making sure that we are having conversations around why we're doing the things that we're doing and the intention behind it, especially when it comes to language. When we're thinking about pronouns in particular, I think a very helpful piece discussion that comes up in this conversation is talking about the myths around pronouns, because this can oftentimes be some of those connotations I was talking about earlier, especially maybe more negative connotations that will come up when people are trying to have these conversations, or when there may be miscommunication about what this means. Oftentimes, as just kind of an example, some pushback that may be received when people maybe are asked for their pronouns, responses that I've heard are, I do not use pronouns. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that is. So obviously from that response, we can tell there's some misinformation happening there already. So similar to that, some other pieces that come up have been one of the pronouns that has been widespread pushback, that has experienced widespread pushback, is using they, them pronouns as a singular pronoun. So we like to emphasize, especially with this, pulling in those conversations around grammar. So not only does the word they have a long history in the English language, we also have regularly used they, referring to a person, singular noun. This is something that is also backed by, if people are looking for kind of references, APA, MLA, as an appropriate use grammatically. That can oftentimes be pushback or difficulty that people are having around using language in a way that they may be unfamiliar with, or where they may see it as being not grammatically correct. So especially in an academic setting, this is something that can come up often, especially depending on the groups that we're talking to, and wanting to also note how important it can be, especially for some, to make sure that institutions, policies, things that we are looking to as kind of the standard of practice in terms to even language, we are acknowledging the different ways that language can be used. Also think it's important to note what is mentioned here, the history of they, them as a singular pronoun. So when we're thinking about this one in particular, oftentimes people will use they, them as a singular pronoun in just everyday conversations, oftentimes without realizing it. So if you see someone walking down the street, you don't know, or you're not picking up on some of those assumptions or signals that you may assume as a particular pronoun based off of what you're seeing. Maybe they drop their wallet and you say, oh, that person dropped their wallet, I should let them know. So using they, them as a singular pronoun oftentimes without even thinking about it, can often come up in award shows when we are trying to be vague about who has received the award, looked at as a way to use gender neutral pronouns. So when we're thinking about this use, pulling in, again, that context piece and how we're discussing pronouns can add a lot of added weight to the conversation, and that can oftentimes lean into other spaces around what we mean in relation to queer and trans people, and how pronouns show up there. So as we said, going off of that, pronoun usage can often generally be seen as a trans issue. When we are talking about this topic in particular, I think it's important to note language is constantly changing, language is constantly evolving, and that is going to change with all languages across the board when we're thinking about the ways that a lot of these conversations can show up in other spaces. It's going to be different culturally, obviously, based off of a lot of the pieces we mentioned before with gender. There's gender identity, expression, perception that can be different across different cultures. That is also different with languages. Spanish, as an example, Latinx has been a term that has been more consistently used, and there's been conversation, like with all language, around how that works. So Latine is another term that has been introduced, especially with languages that are gendered. So that have maybe certain indications providing particular pieces like Latino, Latine, Latina. There are different ways to express or how gender may show up in a particular language. At that same time, there are queer and trans people within those spaces that are having conversations about how to develop and adapt language in ways that work for them. So always want to bring that into the conversation when there can be a lot of focus that this is specifically something that is seen as just a trans issue. It is also sometimes noted as this is more of a trending concept, or this is something that is just a result of the rise of modern queer and trans movements. As we have discussed already, with language constantly changing, as our understanding of these identities change, our evolution of being able to express these things change, language will automatically change as a result as well. Only constant here is change. So wanting to make sure that we are pulling in those conversations and ways that we are using to try to explain this concept to make sure that people understand that although the language or information may be new for them, a lot of these concepts, a lot of these things that we're talking about are not new concepts. Queer and trans people are all over the world. The ways that we talk about our identities has consistently changed throughout time and will continue to do so. So we want to make sure that we are able to critically think about some of these myths that come up and dispel them. Some of the last pieces, which also linked into what I've said as well, the pronouns are fixed over time. Pronouns are representative of someone's gender identity. So oftentimes people may think with certain pronouns that are introduced, especially if they are neopronouns, or maybe more recent pronouns that have been added to our language or have been used more consistently by a larger number of people. People can oftentimes maybe make an assumption or alignment with particular pronouns being linked to particular identities. So if you are someone who is genderqueer, you use they, them pronouns automatically. Wanting to keep in mind that the communities are not monolithic. There are going to be differences in ways that people use pronouns, differences and reasons of why someone is using maybe they, them, their pronouns versus he, them, their. So we're wanting to keep in mind and allow for that context that people can often add an intention behind that as well, and not making false equivalencies or false equations that will map one particular pronoun usage onto someone's gender identity. We don't want to start to make those assumptions there, but also that pronouns are fixed over time. Exploration, especially looking at things like gender exploration, lifelong process. A lot of these processes that we're talking about are lifelong. As I mentioned before, with the evolution of language, the ways that we understand ourselves are constantly evolving as well as we learn more. So we are wanting to keep in mind, especially for the normalization of pronouns, that it's important to make sure that these are things that we also allow flexibility into. So being aware of that can be really helpful, especially in making sure that we are comfortable with changes as they come up, and then also talking about what it looks like to make mistakes if there are changes that are happening, again, that you don't know how to deal with initially. One way in particular that we like to kind of talk about that exploration piece in particular is looking at the example using a story that was provided to us, which we believe is a good way to kind of talk about the idea of a fit, or why maybe someone may be using they them pronouns or sie them sie, fey fair fairs. There are different reasons that people oftentimes will have, especially asking questions about if it's not an alignment of a particular identity with a particular pronoun, why maybe is someone using this particular pronoun over another. So we try to explain that by linking it to shoe size, as this person did in the story. So if we're thinking about a person being born in the beginning of their journey of exploring identity, looking at that as we would look at different labels for shoe sizes in relation to pronouns. So we have a person that is born in our society assigned female at birth. Oftentimes with that, you will also be assigned gender as well as assigned sexual orientation, because of the way that oftentimes people can default to certain pieces or make assumptions based off of maybe knowing some information about a person. So she, her pronouns has been used for this person assigned female at birth, and that throughout their lives can feel like a size 6 shoe, when in reality that is not a true size shoe for this person. So if we're looking at kind of gender exploration, trying on different size shoes, looking at a shoe size that fits better, not one that they were born into, looking at a size 7 shoe, so maybe trying pronouns outside of the she, her series, looking at they, them, theirs. So looking at different ways to express that may fit better, may feel better for them, especially if that presentation or how they are being presented to the world. They, them, their pronouns is a size 7 shoe. So a better fit, still not exactly a great fit, not a true fit to who they are. So looking at changing that shoe size to a size 7.5 shoe size. These changes are a continuous process, so showing that it may be incremental, it may be different types of changes that may occur over the course of someone's lifetime. There's not always a set timeline that people will have. So there is a lot of space, again, for that flexibility to appear. So even looking at, excuse me, people using combinations of different pronouns, or possibly because of interactions that they have with new people that they meet, being introduced to new pronouns that they did not know existed before, or they did not have knowledge of before, and being able to find that on a pathway from a size 7 shoe to a size 8, maybe let's say they find sie, them, their pronouns. So this is a size 8. It fits for them. It's something that works. That is not necessarily always going to be something that others may understand. It could be a very personal experience, and oftentimes may not be something that can be easily communicated or related. Regardless, wanting to make sure that we're acknowledging, just because you may not necessarily understand exactly every decision or why someone is making a certain decision or their intentions behind it, does not mean that we can't validate that experience for the person as well. So when we're thinking about kind of these pieces, and again, the different representations and ways that pronouns can show up, neopronouns in particular is a conversation that often excuse me, comes into the window when we're looking at these neopronouns. This is not an exhaustive list, of course, but some listed that oftentimes will come up. So sie, them, sie, sie self, fey, fair, fairs, fair self, am, ear, ears, earself, and then sie, them, sie, themself. When we're thinking about these pronouns and thinking about the ways that they show up, oftentimes people will have questions kind of around pronoun usage, around neopronouns, development, history, which can be great questions to ask, very extensive also in the ways that they're introduced. So I always like to provide resources that I think are helpful, which is linked here below with pronouns.org. So this is a website that will often be used as a way to provide people further information. Oftentimes in the trainings that we do, it is a time to be able to touch on a topic, but we often do not have as much time as we would like to get into more questions or more depth with a lot of the conversations. So I think it's helpful to have access to these other resources to be able to make sure that we're continuing to do education on our own. With neopronouns in particular, looking at some of the things I've mentioned before, combinations of pronouns, or just using language in a way that you may not be familiar with, it's something that takes effort. It's something that is going to take practice sometimes, depending on your comfortability, depending on your familiarity. So we're wanting to make sure that we're doing that work for ourselves, that we're challenging ourselves to make sure that we are informed and to make sure that we are continuing to educate ourselves to be able to progress, especially in these conversations that we're having. So they will have discussions around neopronouns, around what pronouns are, how to use pronouns, looking at how do you look at language overall. So just thinking about and expanding that to gender inclusive language. So the ways that we oftentimes will gender language with things like ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, how that can come up in a lot of our conversations. Another piece I think is really important here, along with neopronouns, is talking about additional resources. So a lot of times hearing context, hearing stories from people, especially around things like pronouns, can add a lot of depth to your understanding. I also think, especially in our conversations, important to acknowledge the intersectionality piece here too. So talked about a little bit earlier with different languages, but there are queer and trans people all over the world, and there are conversations happening within these different sections of the world that we want to make sure that we are aware of as well. Obviously, it can be very difficult to keep track of everything that is happening, but I think it's also extremely helpful and beneficial to make sure that we are checking in, keeping track of conversations that may be happening around a lot of these same topics and within different cultures, within different spaces. And that can be very informative of what's happening within our own spaces as well, within our own families. When we're talking about this space as well, there also is oftentimes a little bit more complexity
Community Chest, and the American Library Association. Thank you to Cornelius Baker for a great presentation. If you would like to continue the conversation with Cornelius on Zoom, follow the link in the comments. Be sure to tune in next time for Q&A talks. We will have Tate Walker returning to discuss the LGBTQIA+ experience in Indigenous storytelling for our next Q&A talk. And that Q&A talk will be held on the evening of Wednesday, May 15th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. If you would like to find out more about Project Q&A, our work, or to view past Q&A talks, please consider making a tax-deductible donation today. Also, we have our link tree in the comments section, as well as a link to where you can find if you'd like to donate. So if you would like to view past Q&A talks, we also have them archived on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to find out more about our work, visit our website and follow us on social media, please. Thank you for watching our Q&A talk this month. If you have any questions for our presenter, please follow the link in the comments to join us here on Zoom. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.